Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Gary Ryan, and I'm the Executive Director of the Virginia Museum of Contemporary Art. And I'm just thrilled. It looks like we have close to 100 people almost joining us this evening. I want to say first, thank you very much to PNC, who is our signature sponsor of the suite of exhibitions that include Nourish, American Appetite, Real Food Films, and Open Call. And I'm going to very quickly introduce Truly Matthews, who will give you the lay of the land for the rest of the evening, but Truly is our distinguished curator of education. And I just want to say thank you. Thank you, Truly, for arranging this wonderful evening for us, and take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Gary. I would just like to say that welcome, and we are thrilled to be joined by Michael Twitty in celebration of our current suite of exhibitions, which explore themes of food, past and present. I couldn't think of a more fitting speaker than Michael for his knowledge of food history, but also his work centered around culinary justice today. We first began to follow Michael's work during his residency at Colonial Williamsburg, where he explored the history of African and African American culinary techniques and ingredients. And tonight, we're pleased for Michael to share his knowledge of historic Virginia foodways, the roots in what is now Nigeria and the surrounding regions, and how that has impacted our contemporary culture and what we eat today. Before I introduce Michael, I do want to encourage you all to use our chat function. We'd love to hear your questions and comments. My colleague, Catherine Custer, will be monitoring and facilitating the chat. So please ask your questions in the chat. And then at the end of Michael's lecture, we'll have some time for questions at the end. So we'll select the questions and we'll ask you to unmute your mic if you feel comfortable and ask that question directly to Michael. So without further ado, I'd like to kind of give a little more background about Michael. He's a culinary historian, a food writer from Washington, D.C. area. His blog, he has a blog, Afro Colorina. He's also appeared in Bizarre Foods America with Andrew Zimmern, Many Rivers to Cross with Henry Louis Gates, and most recently, Taste the Nation with top chefs Padma Lakshmi. HarperCollins released Twitty's The Cooking Gene in 2017, tracing his ancestry through food from Africa to America, from slavery to freedom. He won several literary prizes for the book, including the 2018 James Beard Award for Best Writing and Book of the Year, making him the first Black author to receive the award. His piece on visiting Ghana was featured in Bon Appetit, winning Best Food Writing in 2019. And he also was nominated for another James Beard Award. His next book, Rice, will be out with UNC Press this year, pretty soon. And Koshersoul, which is his follow-up to The Cooking Gene, will be out in 2020 through HarperCollins. So without further ado, I'll stop talking and we'll like Michael Twitty will share his knowledge with us. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you. So I want to say thank you to everybody for being here this evening. And it is a big part of our story to talk about where these things come from, their origins. A lot of times when people think about Southern food, I remember going to a program in Natchez, Mississippi. And I had been in Natchez before. I remember talking about The Cooking Gene. And I remember saying the words about talking about the African roots of Southern food. And the audience that was predominantly white, older, didn't know what I was talking about. They had no clue. To them, Africa was this lost, dark continent, land of the lost kind of place. And the South was the ultimate America, very familiar to them. And it was kind of brutal. It's kind of sad, actually. And later on, I had the opportunity to, talk with some of the folks, and maybe one or two of the folks who had no clue what I was talking about showed up to this little book signing afterwards. But I asked them, I said, wait a minute, you're born and raised in this area, and you've been here all your life, and you've lived here anywhere from 65 to 85 years. So just please tell me, what did you grow up eating? And I asked them the question, who raised you? And every single one said, well, we had a Black woman who worked for our family. And I said, well, who were your first playmates? And let me guess, her friend, her children, right? Her grandchildren, those were your friends. And let me guess, she took you to church at least once or twice to babysit you, and you sat in the rows, probably in the back row or the front row, one of the two, and it was your first taste of the Black church experience. Oh, and let me also guess, she probably put, a bracelet or a thread or cord around your neck with a pierced coin or something like that, or rabbit's foot. How did you know? How do I know? I said, you don't think that my great grandmother did the same work? I said, you don't think that I've talked to people who just like you from across the Deep South, who have the same exact narrative? And I think that some people would expect that in Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, Louisiana, etc. But we're talking about Virginia, and Virginia is partly my home as well as Maryland. And my ancestors go back to Virginia to the 1600s. And the work that we've done in genealogy and on that has, proved very fruitful. My family is from the Richmond area. My family is from Prince Edward County. My family is from Amelia, Buckingham, Amherst, the whole like James River tobacco growing area. And I also have family that came through Norfolk and folks who were in Southampton County. So to talk about all these different narratives is the first thing we have to talk about is the fact there are different Virginias. The fact that we have a Tidewater Virginia, Piedmont Virginia, Blue Ridge Virginia, and a Mountain Virginia, Appalachian Virginia. And not all these areas have the same history when it comes to the African Virginian presence or the history of enslavement. Obviously, because, Virginia had a break-off state, less because of the agitation against slavery, but more because the economic and political interests were simply not the same. And there was a much smaller Black population. But it's easy to forget when you go to a lot of places in the contemporary South that, and by the way, in the Caribbean and Africa as well, a lot of these places that were bustling with economic activity and people and lives and deaths and pain and people progressing from one spot to the next are very quiet today. So it's really easy to think, okay, nothing much happened here. But the reality is that between 90,000 and 100,000 enslaved Africans disembark after months of hell on a slave ship in Virginia. And those Africans that come here are the center of the Black population. I'm not a numbers guy, but I have to be a numbers guy for the next couple of seconds. Because here's the deal. 100,000 folks show up, give or take. 58,000 of them are from what is called the Bight of Biafra. Some of you who were around during the 60s and 70s remember when Biafra was an independent state. And when Biafra was an independent state, the Ebo people tried to create a nationalistic expression in southeastern Nigeria. And because that area is, full of oil and other natural resources, the rest of Nigeria did not let it go. So it's so critical to remind people that Nigeria didn't exist, several hundred years ago. Not at all. Nigeria is a creation of the colonial empire known as Great Britain. So when Africa was carved up in the 1880s, each colonial power, Britain, Germany, France, etc., Belgium, took their own corners of Africa. And then when independence came, those were divided up into countries. Those countries did not exist. Nigeria has over 300 different ethnic groups. So it's really difficult to imagine all of them getting along in the same country, given centuries of independence to themselves. At any rate, the Bite of Biafra alone, you cannot imagine how large Nigeria is, but also how small some of these regions are comparatively. Nigeria, Texas, and the surrounding states are a bit comparable. So it's pretty big. It's the largest population in Africa, largest country by population. There are about 58,000 people from the Bite of Biafra would arrive during the transatlantic slave trade to Virginia, which lasted probably about the 1690s, when the British acquired the Hacienda, which allowed them to trade on the West African coast from the Spanish crown. And that went up until the gates of the Revolutionary War. 1774, Virginia cuts off the trade. And there's probably a trickle after that, but a trickle. Not that many people show up. But the vast majority of that 100,000 folks, 90 to 100,000 folks, show up, are exiled to Virginia by the transatlantic slave trade, by the business among elites, European and African, during that time period. The question we have to ask is, why them? Why them? They were an affordable commodity as human beings. I must tell you, I've been to Igbo land, been to Nigeria. It's the home of many of my ancestors. In fact, one of the largest ethnic groups that is represented in my genetic genealogy are the Ebo, and they're distant neighbors to the west, the Yoruba and Edo. After that comes Ghana and Sierra Leone and Congo, Angola, and Senegal. But I say that to say that there was a mixture of Africans that were forcibly brought to what is now the United States, but they didn't all come to the same places at the same times and in the same amounts. And so that led to a very striated narrative in terms of African-American history. If you're listening to this, watching this, and you're African-American, your ancestors were actually part of a long trail. It wasn't one event. So you likely have ancestors who were here from the very start, at least one or two, and then a lot that came during the early 18th century, and then a few folks, especially those folks who are from South Carolina, southward and westward. It's highly likely that you have ancestors who didn't arrive here until within a living generation of the Civil War, which would have been illegal according to the U.S. Constitution. But having said that, Virginia is really important for a couple of different reasons. And this is why I think that people who study this history and folks who are the heirs of this cuisine and culture are really passionate about matters of culture and ethnicity and identity and ownership. It's not because it's just, it's just some, unfortunate flu that they're catching. It's because, you have to work through a lot of trauma, and you have to go through a lot of negative things to get to these kernels of connection and connect the dots. It's not as simple as, the Germans grew a lot of wheat and they had a lot of pigs, and so therefore they were great bakers and they made great bacon or ham or whatever. That's not the same history here. This history is about disconnect and resistance and survival and evasion. And that's why it has to be told a certain way. And I remember when I first started working on my take on Southern food history, Virginia food history, African-American foodways. I remember a guy wrote me and he said to me in the most general way, this is all well nice and good, this history stuff and everything else, but it's about the food. It's about the food, man. And he kind of gleefully signed off on the email. And I read it one way and I said, okay, that's nice. And then I read it and read it again. And I patently rejected it because no, we're losing the stories of human beings, of people, of our ancestors. And it is not just about the food. It is about the stories that the food contains and the lives that that food represents. And so therefore, if I don't tell it, I don't encourage other people to tell it, and other people like me don't tell it, it will be lost. And that for us would mean a tertiary death for our ancestors, and we can't allow that. In the African tradition, we say that you need to have at least be able to call on 7 to 10 generations. Part of the reason why I did the work that I did was to be able to even approach that, because our ancestors are very important to our story and our narrative. And you can't possibly understand the history of food in Virginia without going into these more unfortunate parts of our national and local history. So before I say anything else, I want to talk about why, do a who, what, when, where, how, why, what. Virginia was the center of the Black population in the 18th and early 19th century. The center. In other words, if you wanted to find a Black person in America, you were likely to go to the colony and then Commonwealth of Virginia. And the reason why it was the center was because there was a naturally reproducing population in Virginia and nearby Maryland. And that made them unique among all of the colonies and countries where there were Africans who were enslaved in the Americas. And it's because in the sugar colonies, people were worked to death. There was some reproduction and some continuation of the families and the culture. But in the establishment years of those colonies, an African who was enslaved, who was exiled to the islands, could be expected to live 7 to 10 years maximum. And yes, you might start a family, you might have children, but you may not live to see them because of the brutal treatment of the enslaved there. And in the Carolinas, in Georgia, where rice was established, it wasn't so much that the rice killed them, it was the fact that they were being forced to work in conditions that were unhealthy. Also, indigo is extremely unhealthy and cancerous. But the bottom line is, for rice, the mosquitoes, the smallpox, the malaria, the alligators, the poisonous snakes, and then the fact that you're working a time span that you never would have worked in West Africa. I don't know if you all know this or not, but West Africa, the equatorial region is a 11 to 12 and a half hour day maximum, depending upon the time of year. And that daylight time is broken up because of the heat into workable, manageable periods, where sometimes you do slow work, sometimes you do big work, but you're always like working, living, doing things until the sun sets, and then everybody kind of winds down. And then, 2-3 hours after dark, everybody's asleep. That's not the case during American slavery, where it was sun up to sundown, and then even past sundown, if there was a harvest, if there were other activities going on. It was just, a much more harsh system of rural and peasant life. So the fact that we have a winter, a real winter, slows things down in Virginia to a certain extent, although even then, having to make bricks, having to cut wood, doing other tasks, feeding the animals, getting the fields ready, all of that happened in any mild days available and beyond. But it also sort of helped slow down the pace of enslavement, and it forced slaveholders to slow down their pace, and therefore giving a time of respite for the enslaved. In Virginia, of course, the major crop was tobacco, and corn and wheat formed a triad of crops that was raised across the state. There was a minimal cultivation of cotton in the late 18th century going into the 19th. Virginia quickly found out that it was not the best space for the mass cultivation of cotton, which became restricted to the southeastern corner of the state up through the middle and northern neck and some farms, but it was not a cotton state. Tobacco wore off the land, and that meant that people had to be on the move if they didn't have land and access to a land capital, which created the largest forced migration in American history, the domestic slave trade. So because Virginia and nearby Maryland and parts of North Carolina and Delaware had these larger populations of enslaved folks than they bargained for, and because that caused some bit of capitalistic angst among the enslavers, the next best thing was to sell the people or to move the people to the plantations of the lower South, which were established before, during, and after native removal. So all these systems are linked. The idea that we'll get rid of the foreign slave trade. Well, South Carolina didn't like that, and Georgia didn't like it because they could import people as much as they wanted, when they wanted, and they weren't really interested in people from the Chesapeake coming to work in those states, although there was some trade in that. They wanted people from Africa who knew how to grow rice, sugarcane, indigo, cotton, the crops that they cultivated, and were also used to, they believed, the warmer climate. What they didn't know is that it's not always blazing hot in Africa. There's a harmattan season, there's the rainy season. So there are seasons when it's not blazing hot. The dry season I test and show you is a warm time. And that's really what happens. You know, the people who are from Sierra Leone, Liberia, who are the rice growers, and some parts of Senegambia come to South Carolina. People from Congo, Angola also, they make up the vast majority of the enslaved there. People from Ghana and what is now Ghana, what is now Nigeria, and also more Senegambians are coming to Virginia. And also, you know, even though everybody from every background can be found across the colony, then Commonwealth of Virginia, it's a little more complicated than that. If you look at the resources, the work done by Lorena Walsh, who's done a lot of beautiful work on the connection between the slave trade in Virginia. She talks about this in one of her papers that breaks down who went where, for the most part, because there were factors and merchants and managers who dealt with the routes from Bristol, Liverpool, and London to different parts of the Guinea coast. In Virginia, of course, we're talking about a lot of people coming from between Ghana and Nigeria. And this shows in the genetic record, not only in my family history and genetic genealogy, Tim Reed, also Wanda Sykes, Blair Underwood, and many, many others who have found their roots among Ebo and their neighbors. We're also talking about a cluster of people in nearby Cameroon, which I've been to as well. And that whole area, which is now sort of in a political turmoil because the English-speaking part of Cameroon. There's a very similar path of life. Yams are the main crop. Yams are raised in hill agriculture. That would come in handy in Virginia. But in Igbo land, we have the example of Oladaquiano. Some of you may have heard of Oladaquiano. He was a young man, a boy, who was captured and taken to the Caribbean and then to Virginia, and then found his way to freedom and went to England after being on a ship for several years. And Oladaquiano is one of the only people to have given us a written record of what it was meant to be an enslaved person at the time during the Middle Passage. And it's a horrific description. But he also describes in great detail what his world was like from a child's perspective among the Ebo. He lived in a village that, and by the way, when we say villages in Ebo land, we're not talking about a little, vale with a couple people. We're talking about pretty big settlements that stretched over a wide acreage. And that's not including the fields and the farms that made up that settlement. I can attest to you that going to Nigeria, I learned that the word village is really not the right word. It's not quite city and it ain't quite village, but it's certainly not a small place. There's lots of people from every direction, and there's these huge sprawling farms. And it's not just like the farm like we know, it's like little patches of ground, as well as large farms where cassava and yams are grown, and oil palms. So he talks about how the Ebo, he says, we are a nation of dancers and poets. And he talks about the religious piety of the people, how devoted they were to the worship of their deities, the Arishi or Alusi. and how they were very industrious in agriculture and how they grew cotton and spices and pineapples and tobacco and corn. And he probably is alluding to those things because he's seen them in Virginia and wants people to know and understand that was, they were, not only hardworking and smart people, but very artistic and also very much engaged in local government. And when we talk about local government, they were basically a direct democracy among the noble class, the rich, wealthier farmers, and the elites. So they did their government by voting. They really have big chiefs. There were several kingdoms among the Igbo that waned and followed, but they were more based on religious stuff than they were any sort of political economic power. But in the Igbo society, if you wanted to rise up, then you competed through farming and economic activity. And then you could be one of this council of elders that made decisions. And we're going to be very specific. These are men. There are female forms of power and there are male forms of power in most West African traditional societies. Now, what that looks like from the perspective of someone living in 2021 is very different from now, but I assure you, much like Native American populations, excuse me, this sort of gendered power was a bit more than what you saw in European American societies. So now that we talked about all that, which is very important to the story, I assure you, women do the cooking in Igbo land. And because of that, and because they have other skills, they make pottery, they make baskets, they do all these things. African women were highly valued. The problem was that enslavers really wanted African women who had their best childbearing years on them between the ages of 15, which is a little off because you may not have gone through all of the not only the rituals, but the lessons in the bush to become an adult woman. Likewise with young men, so they really wanted people who were at least, able to achieve adulthood in the African sense, because they knew they would have a lot of skill in, their particular area, whether it's farming, blacksmithing, wood carving, etc. They knew they weren't apprentices anymore after that time. And also they just wanted people who could have children and would be able to work them hard. This is important in the sense of, in Virginia, you now have this population that has the highest childbirth rate in Africa. So, for example, the Guinea yam, which is grown particularly in that area, that belt between Ghana, Benin, and Nigeria, you have the highest incidence of twinning in the world. So much so that it's built into the spirituality and religion of the Lower Guinea coast. This would have meant that Igbo women were particularly desired because they could provide slaveholders with a plurality of human labor. And it's disgusting. I hate talking about my ancestors in this way. I've had many times when I've been to some of the slave castles in Africa and also been to some of the plantations and broke down and had an emotional catharsis. But like I said, this is the trauma and that you push through to get to the story where we achieve, where we impact, where we contribute, where we overcome. So yeah, that's the hard part. I got the hard part out. So it's important to kind of keep in mind that slaveholders did have a sense of who they were buying for what purpose. As I said, in the Carolinas, they were keen to get people who knew how to grow rice, keen to get people who knew how to grow indigo. They had some understanding of that. What made the Ebo the majority has been debated by a lot of scholars. Some say that the Ebo were really highly undesired by European buyers, and some say that they weren't. Some say that Ebo were viewed as suicidal, and some say that that's an exaggeration based on anecdotal evidence. But the most important thing we can talk about is the fact that there's so many parallels between the food culture. Now, if you're coming from West Africa to Virginia, colonial Virginia, you've been to Jamestown, you've been to Williamsburg, other places. It's a big difference going from a pot on three stones, which has a sacred significance, which is very practical. I don't know if you've noticed this, but if you've ever seen any pictures from Africa, and particularly West Africa, where there's the pot and there's the three pot shards or stones, the reason why that is particularly brilliant is because it's the women who bring in the firewood. You can pull, if you haven't used up all the wood, you can pull the wood out and therefore not have to worry about completely replacing it day by day, which is a laborious, time-consuming task. That hearth has a name, Eku. The deity, the female deity, the maternal presence of the hearth itself. You know, the one who helps you cook, the spirit of the mothers and the ancestors who help you cook. And the predominant meal would have been fufu, which is the name that West Africans collectively give the pounded yam, pounded plantain or cassava that is eaten with the meal. Now, this may sound like nothing you've had in Virginia, but let me assure you, there were adjustments were made. Sweet potatoes, particularly those that were white or yellow and rather starchy and not the sweetest, were grown en masse in early Virginia. And when they were called Spanish potatoes, because they were brought up from Cuba, Puerto Rico, etc. Even to this day, we have a very yellow species of sweet potato called Puerto Rico. That's the variety name. But these sweet potatoes were more important to the diet than we eat now. To us, sweet potatoes are a side dish, but sweet potatoes to them were a staple in a starch, grown alongside, of course, maize and other crops. The Igbo had, if you go to West Africa, to Eastern Nigeria, you'll see the black-eyed peas everywhere. You see crowder peas everywhere. What we call crowder peas, at least. Those are all cowpeas, so they all have the same kind of form, but different colors. They're extremely important to the diet. You make what's called akara out of them, which are black-eyed pea fritters. And black-eyed pea cakes were found in Virginia down past the Depression. They took different forms. Sometimes they took the fritter form, like you see in Africa. Sometimes they would just mash black-eyed peas into a sufficient sort of pea cake that you would have with other foods like gravy or rice. And even having the peas and the rice is very West African and very traditional. The Igbo would roast meat on occasion during festivals and predominantly season that meat with onion and red pepper and salt. If you're thinking barbecue, you'd be correct. But of course, they were in the presence of other cultures in Virginia, like the Senegambians, who had an even more developed culture of roasting lamb and goat and cow for festivals. You don't see a lot of pork in West Africa unless you're dealing with the coast. And then the Ghanaians and other people who were living with the presence of the Portuguese and the Dutch for an extended period of time were the predominant consumers of pork, and also folks in southern Benin, but not so much in Igbo land, not so much. Although there are no taboos there because they're not in the Muslim part of Nigeria. Stews that go with the fufu are usually made out of tomatoes, smoked fish, onions, other things, water, and whatever pot herbs you can gather, cultivate, or find. There were lots of pumpkins and watermelons and muskmelons in Igbo land, and you even ate the seed, which is called egusi. So the rind, the fruit, everything was used in one form or another. And these were all cultivated in a very sort of ingenious way where, much like the Three Sisters, you would have a tall grass crop, you would have a gourd crop like watermelon or bottle gourds, and you would have a nitrogen fixer. They didn't think of it that way. Black-eyed peas growing up the main stalk, providing nutrients for all the plants, the above. The Igbo were quick to adopt many of the foods that came in from the Americas via the Europeans, although By the time the Ebo got them, they didn't know where they came from or who brought them, with the exception maybe of sweet potatoes, which they called ji mbeke, which means the white man's the white man's yam. To be clear, the Ebo are pretty much not quite landlocked, but pretty landlocked. But there were rivers and creeks that ran through Ebo land where people did some small fishing, but predominantly it was important for the Ebo to get fish by trade. And that trade would have been from the coast. Because of this trade with the coast, there are also political and economic factors that feed into what we know as the transatlantic slave trade. There are three main ports: Old Calabar, New Calabar, and Bonny. And from those, I calculated that my own ancestors, who came from very specific parts of Ebo land, would have only had 2 to 3 to 5 days walk to the coast to be exiled and never see their home again. I am going to now talk about the plantation environment. So when these folks come here, they bring taste for certain foods like okuru. Okuru to them is what you call okra. So that the word okra is essentially owed to the Ebo and Ebo speakers of southeastern Nigeria. And there are many dialects of Ebo, by the way. There's not one. And those folks who are speaking dialects of Twi in Ghana, where it's called Ankra or Nkrumah. So you can see how the words, because they're loosely, distantly related Kwa languages, they have some similar sounds for certain common words among them. So when you go to Nigeria, you'll see like the fried sweet potatoes, the fried black-eyed pea fritters. You will see peanuts used as for a sauce or for a soup. There are different forms of groundnut soup. And when you come to Virginia, you'll see the same things: okra soup, peanut soup, black-eyed pea fritters, barbecued meat, and also fried poultry. So in Nigeria, what you do is, if you're making a stew and you just happen to have a chicken available, typically what you do is you fry it first, and then you cover it in the sauce or the soup that you're using. Sometimes when you go to the markets, you'll see people take little bits of chicken and fry them up in palm oil, which is the predominant cooking fat, and that's like a snack. So you do see all these things, think about fufu. Let's think about like when you eat fufu, you kind of swallow it, you don't really chew it. You use your right hand, you take the fufu, you dip it into the sauce or whatever, and it kind of goes down. And then it took me 3 or 4 trips to West Africa to think, oh, wow, my God, I've seen people do this my whole life, only with biscuits or with cornbread, using those foods in a very similar way. Or the fact certain things that Mary Randolph, who wrote the first Southern Cookbook, talks about. And she grew up, on her plantation, surrounded by people who were only 1 or 2 generations removed or not removed at all from West Africa, and predominantly from what is now Eastern Nigeria. And if you think about it, sorry, I'm trying to clean this off. If you think about it, the women who she was around, very might well have passed on elements of their culture to her. Mary Randolph was highly respected by the enslaved community, so much so that Gabriel Prosser said that he would spare her to be the queen of the kitchen in Virginia. So I'm thinking that she probably had a relationship with people who were of this heritage and learned a lot, but those weren't things that her readers would have been interested in. But there are certainly recipes in the Virginia Housewife, what's considered the first Southern cookbook, that make that connection for us, those who know how to read those ingredients a certain way. I mean, when someone writes about chicken and sweet potatoes, it's sort of a blend of English and West African sensibilities. It's not completely either one. And it's really important to understand that we're talking about a triple heritage, but one where, for the most part, for the past generation, we've seen very little emphasis or understanding on how specific parts of West Africa feed into narratives of Southern culture and cuisine. And of course, we have to acknowledge the indigenous folks. But it's also critical to understand that many of those plants had already crossed the Atlantic. So by the time John Rolfe says, "Oh, we need to grow tobacco to make Virginia rich," they're already growing tobacco en masse in Senegal and Gambia and other places. They already know what tobacco is. They're already growing it for market and for consumption. They're already growing maize. They're already experimenting with maize, and they love their roasting ears. And it's tempting to be able to, you can see that food from both the indigenous perspective and also from the African perspective. And who are we to say, who shot John first? Either way, we're talking about two cultures that really love to eat what we call green corn that had not ripened into field corn. And that says something. The fact that barbecue, the roasting of corn, the making of quick corn cakes, the eating of gruel, which was a part of all three African, European, Native American worlds. All of that's critical to understand that if you are living in your head as an exile, if you are living in your head as somebody who is part of a particular group, and you don't really care about these other folks, then you're seeing the world through your lens. If you're English, the world is English. You're German, the world is German. If you were Tutela-Saponi, that's your perspective. And the fact of the matter is that when those foods were similar among all three groups, they were, permanently stained into the culture, as it were. They were made into heightened as central staples that everybody enjoyed, and everybody, reinforced those tastes in the diet. Virginia had its limitations, but it was also pretty much the heartland of Southern food for the Upper South. And we're going to have to call this Greater Virginia, because I don't want to shirk Maryland in here, because it was the same food. People who try to make a distinction are talking quite nonsense. It's the same food that Frederick Douglass understood on the plantation he grew up on, White House Plantation in the Eastern Shore of Maryland. And it's also the same food in Southern Maryland, all the way up to Baltimore, over to Montgomery County, and from Queen Anne's down to Wicomico. It's the same food, the same Chesapeake culture. And that was the same culture that was brought to Kentucky, to Tennessee, to Missouri, to the Southern Midwest. That was brought to Northeast Texas and Upper Arkansas. It's the same food, the same culture of hams and fish eaten a certain way, although the crustaceans and mollusks did not really travel in the diet. The same kind of game, deer, turkey, and the same customs of frying chicken, the biscuits, but also the gardens full of red peppers and okra and cushaw pumpkin from the West Indies, tropical pumpkin, corn, and all the like. All the usual suspects were brought through these migrations that were pushed on by the impact of slavery. I am going to move to questions, because I'm almost at my limit. So, Julie, what can we do about that?
Yeah, that sounds great, Michael. Thank you. We were just loved, setting us up, giving us the history, the background, and then kind of getting into the food stuff, making us think a lot about the things that we consume today. So thank you. And I'm going to check in with my colleague, Catherine Custer, who has been monitoring our questions in the chat. But also, if you have a question for Michael, we'd love, please put it in the chat, and we may get to you. We have about 15 minutes here or so for questions. So Catherine, if you want to turn your camera on.
Hi, sure. I've been saving some questions during the talk, so let's start with Hannah Kirby. And you might remember from the beginning, I'll say your name and then I'll ask you to unmute, and we will have you ask your question yourself. So Hannah, there we go.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I'm so excited for this talk. I actually am part of a book club, and your first book is our upcoming reading, so I'm very excited. I've read it briefly before, but I wanted to see if you had any other suggested readings. I'm in the museum field as well, so I want to know it for like my own educational background, but also for my book club.
Very cool. So it depends on what you're looking for. And I will say that I've kind of cornered myself into a very niche part of the field here. But I think it's important to revisit some classics. Like Ntozake Shange's If I Can Cook, You Know God Can. And Vertime Grosvenor's book as well. These were folks who really inspired me. These are not big tomes. They're just kind of like musings that were collected into really classic treatments of talking about African-American foodways, the spirit and the mind of African-American, African Atlantic foodways. There's not a lot of folks doing the same kind of work. And I kind of appreciate that for the moment. But I'm also in the habit of getting folks who are doing research on our history and our food culture to sort of branch out, because there are so many areas and topics that need to be covered, and soon, because we have living people who can testify those things. For example, the food of the civil rights movement, it's a huge area, or the foods of great migration communities. Also, that's another part of the chain, right? So if you go from Nigeria to Virginia, then to, let's say, other parts of the Upper South, and then the great migration pieces of that, and then people returning to Virginia even, then there's a lot of parts of the story that need to be covered. And so we're working on it. I mean, anything by Tony Tipton Martin is great. Anything by Nicole Taylor is great. And we have a lot of new and up and coming people who I would love to be able to tell you more about, but they're all in production on their books now. So we will see.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I know you mentioned, oh my God, why am I blanking on the name? Mary Randolph. Do you have any other additional readings for her connection?
So I would say Dining at Monticello is pretty good, Damon Fowler. But I'm going to tell you, it's not. And then there's a collection of essays, and Lenny Sorensen, of course, who was a genius on this, because she worked so many years at Monticello, and did her own research into the enslaved community of Virginia. There's not a whole lot.
Yeah.
I'm going to really quick, and there's not a whole lot for a reason, because people traditionally people would do this research, and they would only focus on one little thing that the museum put them in a box and said, this you can only go here. Well, they never became Africanists. That's my job, because nobody else did it. I remember going to these places very early on and saying, what about Africa? We don't know nothing about Africa. I said, wait a minute. But Africa was right there at Yorktown, 15 minutes drive down the road. What do you mean you don't know about Africa? And folks didn't. They didn't know about West Africa. They'd never been there. They never researched in the Caribbean. So this is, for me, a big part of my work is, going and doing special grants and research projects so that we can begin to have an archive of this information. And there's certain things that I'll be publishing later, but there's not a whole lot. There's not a whole lot. And it's not because it's not there. It's because people don't know how to read the evidence in a sound and scholarly way that connects all the disciplines that are needed to really take a deep dive.
Yep. Thanks, Hannah. And thanks for those recommendations.
Yes, thank you so much.
Catherine, who else do we have?
Yeah, we have a question from Brian Epps. Brian, I'm inviting you to unmute.
Hey there, thank you. Just typed in the chat, Michael. We're curious about how Black producers, farmers, folks working across the food supply chain, mill owners, butchers, etc., can preserve or contribute or even expand the traditions that you're talking about. What ways are valuable? I'm thinking about seed preservation or recipes, some of the work that you're doing, but what are some of the more creative innovations because I feel like the interruption of the stories that you're telling is a function of white supremacy that Black folks always have to change. We always have to shift.
Yes.
What's worth keeping, and what helps us survive and continue to grow.
I really appreciate that. Epps is an old Virginia name. EPPES. Yeah,
That's it. Yep.
yeah. I know. It's like that's the thing. Once you start doing like a lot of genealogy and just start opening your eyes and going over the work, it's like, wow. I know where somebody's from based on their last name. They're like, how did you know? I said, well, there's a plurality, y'all. So to answer your question, it's, right now during this pandemic, I think one of the things that's ironic but somewhat hopeful, I'm not really that proud of it, but I'm proud of people succeeding, and that is that people are drawing on the very things that slavery and segregation, Jim Crow caused. So for example, people are, we don't have no brick and mortar buildings because systemic racism, that says your credit ain't right, or this is no. You can't come here. Your business wouldn't be right here. It's zoning. And yet those businesses are failing while we're doing the takeout thing. We are barbecuing on the road. We are at the farmer's market. It's almost like all those things that held us back have backfired in the pandemic era. And it's not to say that we're all of us are thriving, but a number of my culinary colleagues like Omar Tate, Mashama Bailey, BJ Dennis, there's what is Marvin's Farm in South Carolina? Peculiar Pig, I think it's called, are doing okay because they're doing dinners on farmsteads with picnic tables that are spread across a field, social distance. They're the ones who are doing the takeaway food and the pop-up dinners that don't require people to break the basic rules and be unsafe. And that's a boon. But in terms of the information, I think that it's critical that people do their homework. Talk to your grandparents, talk to your parents, interview them, get that knowledge, understand. I mean, I was talking to one gentleman in Lynchburg, and I learned that like the Bamana groundnut, the one that's found in West Africa, that's more like a pea than it is like a peanut. They were growing that in Virginia. Now I had one person tell me, yeah, but I had no recollection. But the way he described it, they call it a ground pea, and so obviously that made the trip over at some point. The peanut thing. People often try to pick at me and go, well, that's South American, but it can come directly from South America. It came from South America to Africa in 1500 something, and then back over the Atlantic Ocean with the Portuguese, who, by the way, brought the first indentured and enslaved Africans in 1619. So that all of these things fit together, but you need to do your homework. Know it's about going into communities, not just your family, going into communities and saying, let's talk about the food heritage of a place. It's knowing the names of Black creators and Black cooks. Black cooks were not always anonymous. In fact, they were such an important part of the social economy of Virginia and the antebellum South that we know about the lives of a number of these people, and it's incumbent upon us to really research their stories, understand where they come from. To also take ownership of some of these dishes. I mean, recently I've been very upset about the gentrification of Brunswick stew, in the sense of, so the old narrative was Uncle Jimmy Matthews. Well, that doesn't sound like a white guy, does it? But then other people were like, then you notice after the Civil War, during the Lost Cause years, you had people trying to claim that Jimmy Matthews was a white Virginia gentleman, because they didn't want to give credit to enslaved cooks. But if you look at that recipe, you clearly see the influence of Native women, and you clearly see the influence of Black cooks. It's not gentleman's food, squirrel, in a pot full of tomatoes and red pepper. So just knowing your history, knowing these stories, doing the research, making a claim, and also innovating new traditions. I mean, that's also part of it. It's not just going back.
Yeah.
It's using that to have a baseline for future creation, as long as you know what you're talking about.
That's a great question, Brian. I'm glad you brought that up. And thanks, Michael. Catherine, I think we have time for one more question. What do we
Great.
got? I know we had a flurry of questions there at the
Yeah.
end. I just want to get to at least one more. There's so many good ones.
Yes, I know there were a lot of good ones. I'm going to unmute Lynn Johnson to ask her question about the tobacco crop. Lynn, are you there?
I am.
Thank
Can
you.
you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, hi. Hi, Michael. I just had a question. When I was in school, I learned that in Virginia, the tobacco crops were king, but they stripped the soil of a lot of their nutrients. So what they eventually became was Virginia decided, well, we can't make money on our tobacco, so we'll become a slave breeding state. Is that true?
That's that's true. Nope, that's true. And it was done under the guise of what they would do is they would go to crops like corn and wheat. And it's a little bit of more sour irony that Europe, remember, has a revolutionary era that lasts all the way from the end of our revolution through to the 1820s, 30s, and 40s. At that time, Virginia grows more wheat and corn than anything else. And also in the mountains, rye to make liquor. Well, there's a reason for this. That grain is going to feed a Europe that's starving, that is not cultivating grain because they're at war with each other. So think of it like this. Tobacco grown by enslaved Africans in Virginia and Maryland paid the French back for our debt to the American Revolution. And then the grain that was grown by enslaved people in the Chesapeake feeds the folks who were living through the French and German revolutions and beyond. And at the same time, there is a hunger for labor. The United States government knew that people were getting enslaved people illegally from Africa, but they were trying to cut down on that for a number of different reasons. Not the least of which was the fact that, slave ships carried a lot of diseases and illnesses. And also the fact that they did not want to have, there was a perception that Africans who were saltwater or from the boat were more likely to have revolts and rebellions. And that's probably likely because, you bring everybody over who's 18 to 28 and they're all warriors or women trained in war, which they were. They're going to fight back. They wanted people that were they could terrorize, that were domestic. And so there were farms in Virginia. This is certainly not hyperbole, nor is it a legend, that where people had a lot of children and then one day they just be gone. And that's pretty much it. They you didn't always have to have a cash crop. The cash crop, the biggest cash crop for the upper South was a liquidation of human lives. And that's what kept a lot of these people, remember those folks who had inherited these big estates from their great grandparents and great great grandparents from England, and they had the columns and this and that. That's sort of like Federalist, right down to the Federalist architecture that was paid for with human lives. Jefferson, when he dies, remember, that community of enslaved people that he guarded during his lifetime, he could not guard any further because he had so many debts that those folks were used to pay off those debts. Mm-hmm. So it's a really sad history, and it's a history that, and I can tell you right quick, that is a deep part of my own family story. Every time I'm on Amtrak or I go to Richmond and I cross over that area where the old train station is, that area next to it was called the Devil's Half Acre. And that's where, probably 24 of my family, at least were sold away to the lower South or other places. So yeah, it's horrific. But yep. I also would just say this really quickly. The traditions that people brought with them that they would barely remember or were very strong to them, also made it a reality that over much of the South, people would think, eat, talk, and conduct their culture in very similar ways because they would come from the same exact place. And they talked about it in song. There were all these really mournful songs about leaving Virginia. And you know, one of the most popular was taken up by the Minstrels, and it was called Hard Times in Old Virginia. My old miss is she from the country, hard times in old Virginia. And the song talks about in call and response form what it was like to one day think that you were it's cool and then have to leave everybody behind because you were being forced to. So yeah, this is why this history is not easy and never will be.
Yep. Thank you for your question, Lynn. And I just want to thank everyone for joining us on this Thursday evening, choosing to spend your time with Virginia Mocha and Michael. Thank you, Michael, for spending your evening with us. And then on that note, I just want to share with everyone kind of the reason why we decided to bring Michael in is to celebrate our current exhibitions. We have a suite of exhibitions that are on view, all exploring themes of food, past and present, looking back through art history and American history, but also thinking about food justice, food literacy in our contemporary culture. Those are all on view until June 6th. It's free admission thanks to our generous sponsor, PNC Bank. And if you have enjoyed the talk this evening with Michael and plan to visit the museum, we hope that you would consider perhaps joining and becoming a member of Virginia Mocha. It's thanks to our membership. Thank you to all our members who are watching right now that we're able to have these amazing programs with such knowledgeable, talented people as Michael. So I'd like to thank you all for joining us. And we'll hope to see you at Mocha soon.
Thank you.